Thanks, Diggory, for very, very generous introduction. And yeah, I invite people if they feel comfortable, they can have their cameras on. If they're not comfortable, they can keep it off. Throughout the seminar, if you have questions, you can let me know if they are specific to something that I'm talking about in that moment. And I may or may not say we can maybe discuss it at the end, or we might address it in a moment, depending on what is more useful with our time. But yeah, if you don't understand like a word that's being used, don't feel bad about asking for clarification. I can give that immediately. So let me open this in a new window and then share these slides. So basically, today we're going to be talking about weighing. This is a skill that is really important to master in order to, or at least to be familiar with, in order to do well at tournaments, especially once you sort of start to advance past a basic level of having the ability to construct an argument that is persuasive. So for example, maybe you've been noticing that at tournaments, you create arguments that have, maybe the pale format that you might have been taught of like the point, analysis, so mechanisms, why the point is true, examples, and then impact, and a link back. And you're wondering why your points are getting you maybe seconds or thirds or losses if you're in a, two-team format, instead of really getting potentially above every other team in the round or consistently taking wins as opposed to losses. And generally what that will come down to is once you become decent at debating and you can construct those arguments, other teams who are at your same skill level, because again, you're power bracketed at tournaments against teams with sort of relatively similar levels of success so far as you have had, that can mean that it's difficult to explain to the judge why maybe the arguments that you've brought, especially, for example, in VP, when we're talking about a back half situation, right, where you have to compare yourself to your front half and you can't refute them because the nature of the rules of debating means that you can't disagree with them, right? So you're in this position where you often find yourself struggling, especially on back half and VP, to prove that what you're saying should matter more in the debate than something else, because both arguments may plausibly be true, they might both have impact. And that's where weighing will come in. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what it is, why we use it, when we use it, and then we'll talk about different metrics you can use to weigh an argument, and how to deal with conflicting weighing metrics. So what is weighing? So I think we should have, see, this will do. Okay. So you have to compare two arguments, right? There's also a form of weighing I will address maybe at the end of the slide that you may have seen before at tournaments where a speaker will sort of weigh almost in a vacuum or just weigh one argument. When I'm going to be generalizing a lot in the seminar because obviously the individual situation you find yourself in a round, you kind of still have to adapt these skills, but most often you're comparing two arguments and you're explaining why an argument is important or not, like usually why your argument is more important than someone else's argument, regardless of whether or not it is true. Again, you'll often also see people try to weigh on certainty, which will kind of rely on the truth of the argument. So these are general rules, but weighing can be used differently in different contexts. But one really useful way that weighing can help you is, especially when dealing with arguments from the opposition bench or the opposite bench, is to assume that those arguments are true, sort of saying that even if we accept that none of our refutation that's questioning the truth of these claims is believable, right? That we totally take their argument at their best, why our argument should still triumph over theirs. So that is a common use for weighing because it enables you to not have to have convinced the judge that in fact you have destroyed their points and yours still stand. You can instead say, listen, taking them at their best and maybe taking our most realistic case scenario, because if you simply compare your best case to their best case, you might be assuming a level of mechanism within your argument that you don't have. So be as charitable as possible to them and very realistic to your own case, and that enables you to sort of buffer your arguments against a judge who might think that your refutation is not all that compelling, and therefore that their material is still more important than yours. So it also helps you to explain why impact should matter to the person you're trying to convince, right? This is just like the basics of the skill. So again, debating uses the framework of the average informed voter, or average intelligent voter, or globally informed voter, or whatever. And the idea is that whether you're looking at it from a global perspective or what the average informed voter would think about the perspective of a given actor in an actor motion, there's going to be different impacts in the debate that you're going to have to contend with. So why is the one that you're bringing, for example, on back half more important than the one that your front half is bringing? So now I just want to engage with that sort of other scenario that I mentioned earlier, where you might see a speaker, for example, in a PM speech, this is quite common, or any first speech, weighing something without weighing it in direct opposition to another claim. So the reason this is done is because, as we'll talk about more in a moment, weighing is something that you really want to have like a robust explanation for, in terms of like, what is the metric you're using on, like, give me an example of why we should care about it. We'll talk about how to do that in a moment. But this is something that takes analytical time, and something that you should also be thinking about in prep time, because it helps strategize your case so that it is like that it represents a path to victory over other plausible impacts in the round. So in doing that, you might, like, you should always, and this is my number one piece of advice, if I could give a singular piece of debate advice to everyone at any stage of their debate career, it would be to prep both sides in prep time. And weighing is important there because it gets you an idea of, again, what are the strong claims on both sides? How can you potentially weigh the more persuasive claims on your side? That, again, you can determine if they're more persuasive by trying to assign weighing metrics to them. And then to basically figure out, what is my best argument? What's their best argument? How am I going to make my best argument be something that matters more to the judge than their best argument? And you'll also hear that referred to as framing. I have another seminar on that that you can go check out online, but maybe I can do a longer one for Seed if they bring me back. So basically, when we talk about weighing, it's something that needs to be set up early. That's what I'm trying to get out. It's something that you can't just assert. A lot of people like to just be like, this weighs over X because it matters or whatever. And we, as judges, are going to have a hard time really taking that into account and making that a rationale for giving you the win. So it can be useful both to think strategically as a first speaker and to start your weighing early and give your partner, something to work off of, to have a weighing metric in a first speech, like, even if you are not certain what the other side is going to run. So, for example, maybe you don't know exactly which of 2 or 3 points might be their best, or may depend on how they interpret the motion, or whether they prioritize a principled approach or practical approach. Sometimes it's not going to be clear. And to the extent that the first speaker doesn't want to necessarily pigeonhole themselves into directly comparing against an argument that they themselves aren't sure isn't going to come up in the round, it can be useful for the first speaker to weigh an argument in a vacuum. So essentially, we'll talk about weighing metrics in a moment. This will become more clear, but basically what you're doing is you're quantifying, like, putting your argument on the scale and trying to quantify how big is its impact. There's no real objective way to do this. Again, this is all going to be pulling at intuition, as we'll see in a second. But if you can give me a quantifiable or a seemingly concrete way in which your impact counts and matters, right? Even if it's not that it matters more than X argument that you're anticipating from the other side, it can be a good starting point for your partner, as well as for the judge, even to just get a sense of, okay, this argument matters because it affects a lot of people, right? Maybe it doesn't affect more people than the argument I'm anticipating from opposition because I don't actually know what they're going to say. But maybe my argument about, I don't know, mental health issues is something I can sort of weigh in a vacuum by saying that this argument should be weighed heavily in the round, right? You'll hear that as a phrase from PM speakers, because it affects everyone, or like most people in the world who deal with mental health struggles at some point throughout their life. Or again, this works especially if you're like introducing an argument that's not intuitively super persuasive in its impact. So if you're thinking about something like microaggressions, right? And you're trying to think, how am I going to get this in the judge's brain that this is important, even though as a first speaker, maybe I don't exactly have something that I'm confidently going to weigh against. You can say, well, the reason this argument about avoiding microaggressions, which again is things like exoticizing a Black person's hair, or little things like misgendering someone that can be harmful to a person's marginalized identity, even if not in a very significant and severe way. So the way I might make that sound impactful to the judge is to say something like, this should be weighed heavily because even though, right, we concede that it might not be all that severe on each incident, it happens frequently, right? Frequency, we'll talk about that later on as a weighing metric. And it happens to a vulnerable group of people, right? People who are part of identity groups that are pushed to the margins of society. So you can be sort of doing that first half of the weighing, setting up the metric for your argument, even if you're not entirely sure or you're not entirely ready to respond to because someone has not yet made the argument. Or you don't know what like the strongest claim on op is. You've only heard maybe one of their speeches and you're still trying to determine how different arguments will interact in the debate. It can be useful for you, especially as a first speaker, to at least do the first half of that. Okay, so when should you wait? This was something that we touched on last slide, but to finish that off, basically preemptively, right, you do want to set up the actors or the goals of the debate, or just, again, the way in which your impact could be quantified or could be considered to be important, right? If you say that this impact matters, why does it matter? And that's the weighing. Like comparative weighing is saying, well, it matters more than something else. And that is definitely what you, especially as a second speaker, should be trying to do, because that takes the judge's, conjecture out of the question and leaves it entirely up to you explaining why you beat the next best point. But as a first speaker, yeah, you can do the first half of that. So you should think about weighing during prep time as we flagged before, right? You should think about it as you're giving your argument. Every single speech in the round, you should be weighing. Again, preemptively, the first half of that weighing, give a metric for why your argument matters. That's first speaker stuff. Although again, later that you are into the debate, so if you're an extension speaker, so the first speaker on back half in BP, it can also be good to be directly weighing against especially what your front half said. So if you're doing what's called a horizontal extension, which is essentially just probably what you typically conceive of as an extension where you run like an entirely different argument to front half. So if they talked about like human rights, you are talking about like, I don't know, basically you can talk about like the economy. I don't know, probably not that great of an argument in a human rights debate, but say that that's your case, right? You're talking about a different impact than front half, or front half is talking about the impact on parents and you're talking about the impact on children, right? Like a different actor. If you are talking about a different clash on back half or a different actor within the same clash, an impact that is fundamentally different to your front half, right? If you were given a horizontal extension, again, as opposed to just adding on to what they're saying with a vertical extension on the same particular point, you should tell me why the impact they're going for isn't important, or not isn't important at all, because that's not realistic nor charitable to your front half, but isn't as important as what you're saying. So if you are an extension speaker, it can be particularly important to set up that weighing comparatively, particularly against your front half. You could also do it against your diagonal, which is the team that's on the opposite side of the debate, but also on the front half. So you can think about it if you're sitting in a room, they're diagonally from you. If you're CG, that's OO. But especially, again, to help you clearly beat your front half who you cannot directly refute, you still need to convince the judge you're better than them. Weighing is a fantastic tool, and it can be very useful for extension speakers to practice thinking in prep time about, okay, what might my front half say? What are the obvious impacts in this round? What things could I add to those as vertical extensions? And if I have time at the end, maybe we'll talk about how to weigh a vertical extension, but that's a little bit more advanced maybe for another seminar. But if you're giving, again, a different impact on your front half, very easy to just tell me, well, my impact matters more than theirs because it affects more people, it happens more frequently, it has a more long-term impact, whatever, right? And that you should be doing out the gate and not leaving all for your whip speaker because you've already heard your front half and you've already had prep time and a whole debate to think about it. So you really want to be practicing figuring out your path to victory proactively as an extension speaker in particular. Okay, so yeah, your second speakers, they are the ones who are going to be probably thinking way more about this in prep time. Like the reason I'm hammering it in for first speakers is that they tend to think they can get away with not thinking about it because there's always the second speech to do all the comparative weighing. But you really don't want to leave your second speaker, while that is more so their job because again, they've heard the responses and the other arguments from the other teams, especially whip speaker who's sort of engaging with everything that's been said from all the teams in the debate. That is obviously a lot on their plate, especially in 5-minute BP speeches. So you really want to make it easier for them. As a second speaker, historically, or at least a whip speaker on back half. Extensions, like learning to pull their weight by doing the analytical work to think of a weighing metric against potential front half arguments and then adjusting as the debate goes along, uh, makes your whip's job so much easier and means that they're not scrambling at the end of the round to, in 5 minutes, do all the refutation that their partner left out, as well as all the weighing, for example, against their front half as well. Okay, during prep time, this is the golden rule that we talked about a moment ago in terms of being adept at uh, thinking about where the debate might go during prep. Again, I'm going to be telling you things that you might be thinking, oh my God, what did she mean by in 15 minutes as I'm like running to my room, thinking about what the other side's going to say, running through a list of weighing metrics in my brain, thinking about what my front half might say and how I'm going to compare to that. Like these obviously sound like a lot of things to do. The point is that you're going to fail at this a lot, right? But you have to try to do it, because if you're not trying to be ambitious during prep time, to be really sacrificing, for example, the extent to which you can get in depth analyzing your argument on the paper, for the ability to think strategically about where the clash will go, like, sure, you might continue to speak, 77, 78s and feel pretty good about how you're doing as a debater, or maybe like 75 is, stay average as a speaker. And that's fantastic. And we love that. These are all great speaker scores. You should be proud of yourselves. But if you are trying to really make sort of like level up your speaking, right? And get into that mindset that you see very good debaters having, where they can easily do this type of weighing in a round, that takes some trial and some failure, right? Trial and error. So you might notice that you're going to have some time management issues in prep time for the first few rounds where you do this. It's a good idea to do spars to kind of practice this in an environment where you're not at a tournament. But again, tournaments are also a great place to fail and learn, and you'll get even better judging there. So uh, don't be afraid of failure. You're going to need to learn how to manage the 15 minutes while spending a lot of time, potentially maybe like 5 minutes, 6 minutes, or even more, especially if you're a second speaker. You might be spending basically all of prep time just thinking through the clash and thinking about potential weighing metrics for your side, versus like to advance your best arguments over their best arguments. And writing these out, like focusing on writing out, for example, why this argument weighs over this other argument, even though the debate hasn't started, right? That sounds like a lot of forethought that might lead to you maybe misjudging which way the round is going and then ending up with not much on your page come the actual round and finding yourself struggling to fill time. These things may happen, right? But it's necessary that you push yourself to advance like towards that goal, right? Because otherwise you'll get stuck in the habit of just like writing down whatever ideas you have in prep time, and trying to think of examples, trying to think of actors who matter, as opposed to strategically thinking about how you're going to beat the other side. So yeah, there's always trade-offs in motions. If you ever find yourself thinking that obviously your side is superior in a debate, or obviously their argument doesn't matter, or obviously there's no harms to this policy. I hear this a lot in high school debate, and it really, really makes me sad, because I'm like, one, these CAs, they spent so long thinking about balanced motions for you to debate, and they do mess up sometimes. Not every motion is balanced, but generally there's almost always some trade-off, and it's usually pretty substantive, right? In order for you to be able to debate the motion from any side. So please, get rid of any words from your vocabulary that say, like, there's basically no harm to doing X, because I hear that a lot in rounds. It'll help you engage more charitably, and also it'll mean that you will actually be thinking about how you have to weigh your own argument, as opposed to just assuming that, well, here's a benefit, they clearly have nothing, when that's not realistically going to be the case. Okay, identify the trade-off. This involves making concessions, right? That's a thing that I say to my students a lot, a word that, becomes almost like a catchphrase: make more concessions, engage more charitably. It's something that you probably would understand more if you do more judging. So it's another way that you can sort of advance your weighing brain, is to judge rounds with a good chair and see the ways in which the trade-offs actually end up manifesting in the round. And then that'll help you be able to foresee, okay, when I'm in a debate, I can see how I might be vulnerable to this particular trade-off or this attack, and I should explain why it's worth it in order to actually win come the end of everyone's 8 speeches, right? So judging with a good judge is a good way to get a better sense of this. Okay, during each argument, what do? Right? You identify mix. reasons why something is true. You weigh them against mechanisms from other teams. So again, the idea of weighing a mechanism, like obviously this is where we get a little like gray area in terms of what is weighing, or are you weighing an impact? Can you weigh a mechanism? What does that even mean? Don't get bogged down in the definitions, right? You basically want to explain, and this goes into weighing a vertical extension. So for those of you who are more advanced and are familiar with the idea of running a vertical extension, where you add on analysis, usually mechanisms to a front half argument. For example, if they're missing the premise for how they get to their impact, you fill that in and say, because their impact is premised, relies on this mechanism, this core mechanism, this premise, we can claim the impact. So in doing so, yes, you're weighing as a vertical extension who added the premise to your front half's claim might have to be to sort of weigh the mech as to like, why is this mech so much more important than maybe the other reasons they gave? And that tends to come down to a question of thinking about logical priority, right? Like oh, okay, we have a question in the chat. Yes. Before I get into very complicated questions of logical priority, let's talk about types of mechs. So I don't really have a typology for different types of mechanisms, but to give you just like a very simple example of what a mechanism can look like, here's one example I'd like to use a lot, okay? Say that you're in a BP round. The motion is this house would legalize all drugs. Got it? Legalize all drugs. That's not like treatment for medicate for conditions, right? We're talking about narcotics like cocaine, psychedelics, things that hopefully, you are not engaging with as a very respectful child of our future generation. But, ideas about legalizing them, right? Why might we be legalizing them? Oftentimes you'll see this debated in the media. Generally, you could make the argument that it saves lives because people die when they have to take drugs that are not regulated by the government. So if you're on front half, if you're on OG, you might make the argument that we should legalize drugs because it saves lives. And then you might give a mechanism for that argument saying it saves lives because, yeah, you can control what's actually in the drugs. You reduce contamination. You could give another mechanism for the argument, right? Mechanisms, again, reasons why something is true. So it's true because it's true that legalizing drugs saves lives because we can, control drugs for contamination. It might also be true that it saves lives because it enables people to be more willing to contact like health services, like call an ambulance, right? If there's an overdose, as opposed to be afraid of either the stigma or potentially the criminal consequences that would be entailed in using that illegal drug. So maybe they're more likely to get help. That could be another mechanism, right? So say that your front half just gives the mechanism for we purify drugs. We make sure there's no contaminants. If you're vertically extending on back half and you're like, we have another reason why this is true, which is, that people feel comfortable now contacting medical assistance instead of letting people pass away, for example, from an overdose, out of fear, right? They don't do that because they don't care. They do that because they're afraid. So in that context, if you're CG and you are adding on this new reason why something is true, you would want to be explaining why your reason is better than their reason. That's what we mean by weighing mechanisms. So you can generally, I think the best way to do this, and this was what I was saying about logical priority, is just to ask yourself which mechanism is more crucial to proving the argument, right? So if not for like the link that you gave, why would that argument maybe not have as big an impact or not be as persuasive, not have as long-term in like an impact in the round? So when you're thinking about weighing mechanisms specifically, you're just asking yourself, if you can't use the traditional metrics that we'll talk about in a moment, how crucial is this to the argument? But for this mechanism, to bring it into a legal context, how would this argument still be as strong? So again, I wouldn't think too much about weighing mechs against one another in vertical extensions. If you're newer to debate, you probably just want to familiarize yourself with the core idea of weighing impacts against one another. So know your impact, compare it to other impacts. This is the bread and butter of what I want you guys to take home from the seminar, right? Common weighing metrics. So I believe Anais put together, she did a fantastic job of listing a bunch of metrics. I was going to add to it. Honestly, this is quite extensive. This is not an exclusive list, though, yeah, I think not an exclusive list. There are potentially an infinite number of weighing metrics. What a weighing metric is just a way, I know, a manner in which you can quantify or give like clarity to, really. It doesn't have to be actually quantifying something, but to give a sense of realness to the impact and its scope. How big is that impact? Why is it particularly important? So you see the word scope here used itself. I tend to find that easier to think of like as just like number of people. That's usually the way that that's used, because obviously scope could also just be like how big is your impact more broadly. So uh, common weighing metrics that you can use in rounds to explain to me why your argument should be considered highly by the judge, should be weighed highly by the judge, should be weighed over something else that should be less relevant to the judge's consideration, right? Something another team said. You can think about scope as in number of people. So, and it doesn't have to be people, right? It could be, I've heard a very persuasive manner of doing this weighing actually, where someone was arguing for animal rights and they were basically saying um, that they were arguing that like if we think about, say that a chicken, right, is like 1% as valuable as a person, for example, if we were to assign some kind of quantification, right, to the value of a chicken's life, because it's less sentient than us, it can, you know, have less complex relationships with people, all the reasons we don't grant chickens the same rights as people. Let's say that chickens are worth 1% of a person. So the argument goes as follows, right? If chickens are worth 1% of a person, which is quite little, what happens given like to the fact that the average person probably eats more than 100 chickens in their life if they're a meat eater? And does that mean that they kill a person? So again, this may sound crazy to you. It was made probably more persuasively than I'm doing it off the top of my head right now. But the idea here is that it doesn't have to be a number of people. In fact, it actually can work quite well when you're making an animal rights argument to say we should value the rights of animals because there's so many of them, right? Maybe one person getting joy out of eating 100 chickens is in fact not worth it, and is a like unfair way to prioritize the human satisfaction over the many, many lives of these other animals. So yeah, number of beings, you can call it that. Severity. This is more so the idea that within each person or chicken or whatever, there is a degree of impact that happens. So in the motion about legalizing drugs, with the argument about making drugs safer to take, right? Understanding that people probably use drugs in both worlds. The idea being that, you know, we should legalize them because it saves the lives of addicts. Well, Ott might come up here and say, okay, but there aren't that many addicts, right? They might try to push back on the scope of our argument or the amount of people that we impact. But we could use severity here to say, actually, the impact on each individual addict is so extreme because it's a life or death consequence, right? Um, and therefore, even if there are not that many people affected, each person is affected to a great extent. Then if we were to look at certainty, right? This is something I flagged earlier. It's a little bit of an outlier because it kind of addresses, instead of the impact side of the argument, so like what is the outcome and how big is that outcome, it addresses the mechanism part of the argument. So how likely is that outcome to manifest? How well proven is it? Um, Certainty works well, especially in the case of weighing a principle, which some people will tell you that you can't weigh principles because principles are fundamentally not about adjudicating trade-offs between benefits and losses and utilitarian ways of understanding those things. If that's all gibberish to you, don't worry about it. But for those of you who've made principled arguments or who will encounter principled arguments in rounds, you know, arguments that don't have impacts, right? They just talk about moral rules that you shouldn't violate. I find one way to argue that principles matter is to talk about their certainty, right? To say, listen, if we can prove using, say, intuition pumps, thought experiments that I'll give more examples of in the next slide. If we can prove that this is a duty that people think is important, right? Maybe we should prioritize that duty over, say, the questionable practical outcomes that may or may not result, right? Because if we know that we care about, for example, the right to life, or we know that we care about the right to privacy, maybe it's more important that we choose to protect that because we know that this motion is violating it for with 100% certainty, as opposed to, or a high degree of certainty, as opposed to opposition who's sort of trying to mechanize that a particular outcome may or may not manifest without being able to be certain whether or not that's the case. So yeah, apparently there's a seminar on principles next month. So tune in for that if you want to learn more about what they are and how to argue them. But all you need to know for our purposes is that most arguments you encounter in debates are practical arguments. They have outcomes, i.e. impacts, right? So we shouldn't legalize, or we should legalize drugs because it saves lives. That's an outcome, that's an impact. A principle would say something like, we should legalize drugs because it enables people's fundamental right to bodily autonomy, right? So the government shouldn't get to tell me what to put in my body, even if they're telling me that for my own good, because if I put that thing in my body, I might become sick or die. Maybe it is my human obligation to myself and other people's obligation to allow me to choose what I put in my body. That's a principle, right? It's not about a specific result that might happen. In fact, it often flies in the face of harmful outcomes. So me taking drugs that are bad for me, but says that the government's role is not to maybe intervene and tell me what is best for me because only I can decide that for myself. So a principle, right? You can imagine that is great question. Is informed consent also a principle? Yes, consent as a whole is often used as a principle. So to say that people should not be able to make choices that they're not like adequately informed in order to consent to, or that you have to consent into something in order for it to be legitimate. Yes, those are definitely principles that you might see in rounds. The trick to figure out if it's a principle is ask yourself, is it dependent on an outcome? Generally, our conception of principles is that they are true even when the outcomes are not good, right? It doesn't depend on having a good outcome. So for example, with consent, we might say that people can consent into, and this goes into the idea of bodily autonomy, right? Into taking drugs that are harmful to them if they understand the risks because they know their own preferences, right? Okay, great question. So yeah, certainty is useful as a tool when there's clearly like a difference between how sure we are that a certain outcome will happen versus another or like versus a principle, for example, that's like a rule that is presumably always true, so long as we think it's intuitive. So in the context of practical debates, you'll often also see certainty used as like a way to weigh against. So in a debate about nuclear weapons, right? You might see the idea of like, what if a rogue actor gets access to the nuclear codes and, wipes out all of humanity, or a mistake is made that wipes out all of humanity. These are legitimate arguments, obviously, but if you're weighing against them, you can say, listen, like, Op has been very persuasive as to why this is a risk. However, because we think that the certainty of that risk is quite low, right? That the existential threat of nuclear weapons is not particularly high and relies on very exceptional mechanisms aligning in the right order in order to produce that world-ending outcome. You should prioritize our arguments about like geopolitical relations resulting from like the ability to use nuclear weapons to disincentivize war, right? You can say that even if the risk of the very severe outcome happening is low, or because that risk is low, you should prioritize the more probable but smaller impact on our side of having nuclear weapons, encourage international actors to use other avenues for resolving conflicts before turning to war because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. Okay. Particular obligation or uniqueness, actually, let me touch on this. I think this is a particularly important one. You'll also hear this referred to, I like to call it as like exclusivity. What it means is that I think there's sort of two forms of exclusivity or uniqueness. One, that your argument is unique or exclusive to the motion, and one that your argument is unique or exclusive to your side. The second one is more important. So to give you an example of each, in a lot of arguments that are non-exclusive to the motion are often things that happen through a bunch of different policies or like are just common results of doing things in government. So for example, saying that something will take away jobs, right? or saying that something costs money, or saying that something will produce some backlash, right? These are things that kind of happen a lot of the time in response to all sorts of things going on. It's basically just a reality of any political decision or any even individual action that a person might take. And for that reason, it can be easy to sort of wash them out of the ground and say they are not that important because they might happen anyways, essentially, or they're like, this is not the only way to stop this thing. So we could deal with it with other strategies. That is exclusivity, right? You could say that an argument should be mattered more or should be weighed more, that it matters more because it has a more exclusive impact to this motion. For example, if this is the only way to save lives of people who die from overdoses, because you can only do so much harm reduction work when these drugs are illegal, right? And when you can't buy them from a reliable source. So if you can argue that this is like the only way to solve the problem, then that is an argument that's very exclusive to the motion. In terms of something being exclusive to your side, this is where you can directly wash something out, which is why I said it is particularly persuasive. So if something happens in both worlds, like under status quo and under the policy, then it's probably not something that gets a lot of margin of difference in the debate. So again, you can imagine a similar clash of like backlash, saying that backlash against, for example, a social movement, doing one thing, while that might be potentially likely, say that if the motion's about like this house as the feminist movement would speak out in favor of Palestine or whatever, something controversial, like prop can argue that this would yield some backlash because some people, are not pro-Palestine, but then op can probably also argue that not speaking out in support of Palestine when there's pressure on the movement to do so could yield the opposite response, backlash from, actors who do support Palestine. And if they argue that that base is reasonably sizable, then again, that can be a wash in the ground. So you can see how these things become useful strategies in prep time, right? When you're thinking about a potential argument, considering its exclusivity and whether or not the other side can say it also happens in their world, or the other side can say, well, we could deal with this through another policy, a different motion, a different issue. This is kind of a reality of like the world that is not particularly relevant to the debate. Any of these things make an argument not persuasive to the extent that you probably also shouldn't run it in the round. So that's when you're weighing in prep time, when you're going through this list of metrics in your head or on a sheet, you can write them down. That gives you a chance to prevent your argument from being so vulnerable to those types of attacks in the round. Okay. Moral, or okay, wait, I'm skipping through the list. Let's be quicker. Particular obligations. This is good for principles too. It basically says that, especially when we talk about moral duties, that a particular actor, like the government that's carrying out the motion, if it's one that would be done by a government, has an obligation to the specific group that this is affecting to do the specific thing. So you might see motions about like land back, for example, and you could argue that the Canadian government has a particular obligation to like return land to Indigenous people, as opposed to maybe enrich the economy through allowing private investment to use that land for extraction purposes. So you could say that the government has a unique obligation to these people because we've wronged them in the past. That's usually one of the reasons why there might be a special obligation. It could also be because of like a reciprocal relationships. You could say that actually a government should prioritize its people more than other people in different countries because we pay taxes, right? So there's this reciprocal relationship. Same thing, why you should maybe prioritize your family over a stranger. All these things could be reasons why an impact or, again, a moral duty, a principle, should be prioritized over something else. So urgency. This is about basically how, like, how do I put this? Yeah, it's kind of intuitive in the word, right? How necessary it is to act now versus how badly something could escalate if we don't act now. So an example of where this is relevant in debates about climate change, AI, right, where the future is kind of scary and potentially getting a lot worse exponentially. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? So if you're maybe weak on the certainty front, you can push back with the urgency stuff. Why action now is so much more valuable than action later. Moral culpability, this goes back to particular obligations, right? That's one way in which you might have special obligations. it also could be an argument as to why an impact that affects a culpable actor matters less than an impact that affects an innocent actor, right? So you'll see this with arguments as to why, for example, we are maybe legitimate in taking away certain rights from prisoners that we wouldn't be legitimate in taking away from the average citizen because they committed a crime. Talk to me later if you want to know more about why I think that's kind of not all that persuasive, but certainly in its theoretical, pure, formalistic sense, that could be an application of certain people are more guilty, right, more culpable, like have more blame for something, therefore we can treat them maybe differently. Okay, vulnerability, this is a common one. This is like how susceptible to harm is a particular group. So if you think about vulnerable groups in society, right, like marginalized races, especially Black and Indigenous people, people in countries that are have less access to resources, right, in the global South, especially people who are less wealthy in those countries, less wealthy people in general, women, gender minorities, yeah, queer people, trans people. Again, vulnerability is one metric, but you don't want to over rely on vulnerability, because if something affects a very, very niche, very, very vulnerable group that no one else in the world, especially if that the scope or the severity of the impact on each of those people is not that significant, might be hard to weigh in the round. So you want to be thinking about using multiple metrics, ideally, or at least considering how multiple metrics could work for your argument in order to ensure that there is like a weighable, good, big impact that you have. Okay, irreversibility. This is a great one. So when you're talking about climate change, AI, again, the common thing that will come up. Also, when we talk about like if you're arguing something is reversible, you could be pushing that because, for example, political cycles. I often use this in politics debates where, if, for example, the motion is about like a social movement using its resources to prioritize pushing for something, which is a common sort of motion structure that you'll see. If that movement is spending its resources on getting a political outcome that is then reversed in the next political cycle after the election, that is money that you can never get back to, for example, you cannot reverse the like opportunity cost, right, of not having spent that money to, for example, like give direct aid to people who need it. Like if you're a anti-poverty organization, there could be a weighing metric for prioritizing doing mutual aid work, giving money directly to like homeless people, for example, instead of funneling your money into like a lobbying campaign to try to get a political outcome that might then be knocked back in the next election when a different government comes in. Okay, prerequisites. This is the idea of logical priority that I flagged a moment ago. So it basically says that on the chain of logic, X leads to Y leads to Z, right? The thing that you're saying is closer to the basis of that chain. The thing that they're saying is what we would say maybe downstream from what you're arguing, or has a lower logical priority. So like, for example, one way that you might consider logical priority is going back to legalizing drugs motion. If your front half is arguing this idea of safety for addicts and you're vertically extending on it, forget the extension we thought of before. Consider instead that maybe your extension is about why people will buy from the government, why people will buy from government stores, buy their drugs from the government instead of from their dealers. Because maybe, again, if you're thinking through the clash in prep time, you might come to the conclusion that opposition could push back on your point by saying, listen, there will be a black market. People will still buy from their dealers because the government is not giving them strong enough drugs, or the government is making those drugs harder to access. They have to go to the store and it's only open at sometimes, or the government is like charging them more, right? Any of these things, they could say that therefore people will continue to buy from their dealers and therefore still suffer all the harms, potentially fatal harms of contamination, etc. So if you are CG, very easy way to take the first. You can think of a vertical extension that says, listen, front half has this excellent impact about saving lives, we agree. But in order for their mechanisms to be true, like to produce the impact of saving lives, they rely on proving that the government, responding to often direct refutation in the round from the other bench, that the government is actually going to be the place that people turn to get their drugs, and that they're not going to go continue using these alternative sources as we waste government money on a program that doesn't get uptake, right? So in that case, you especially could weigh, if you are CG against OG, right, on the basis of logical priority and say, if not for, but for our mechanism about why people will choose to buy from the government, maybe because people like to do things that are following the law and there's stigma about going, into a back alley and dealing with a sketchy person. You would avoid doing that if you could. If you can prove any amount of that, right, even if not 100%, you can say that you basically unlocked front house impacts, right? This is a prerequisite. It is necessary in order to prove that then people will use these drugs and get all these benefits, as opposed to continue using the street drugs. Okay, counterbalancing forces. This maybe is relevant in like narrative motions, I would think, if you can argue that, like, for example, in a motion about this house supports a narrative of like selflessness, you could argue that your impacts about people putting themselves second are more relevant in the debate than ops arguments about people not prioritizing themselves enough, because the current status quo world involves a lot of counterbalancing forces, for example, capitalist forces that tell people that they need to win the rat race and make more money than their neighbor and become more successful, and every person for themselves, right? So you could say that therefore our arguments about enabling people to be altruistic are more important because there is a strong counterbalance, another narrative, for example, or another incentive structure in society that pushes us too far away from the ideal balance, right? So our argument is sort of bringing us closer to that balance. Okay, yeah. Notice how I explained all of these. You guys want to be doing that also. You won't be taking as long because you'll be picking like one, maybe two of these metrics to actually explain. Don't say the word and move on. This needs to be a project for both speakers. Again, I mentioned how the first speaker can play a big role in that, as well as the second speaker. If you just throw it out there, I know that people love to like also just pile on weighing metrics without explaining why they're relevant. Don't do that. I see people do that all the time, and it just isn't useful use of their time. So tell me how, don't say that this has a big scope. Tell me that it affects like more people than their impact, right? Or it affects a lot of people because X, Y, Z, blah, 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 right? Lots of people have mental health issues. Lots of people, experience whatever it is that you're talking about in the round. Okay. I think this is the last thing we're going to talk about is just how to justify your weighting metrics. So this isn't your number one concern at this level generally. This becomes more important when you are in a debate where like everyone is weighing really well, right? Because I told you that currently your experience is probably that you're constructing an argument decently and the other side is doing that too. So if you do the weighing as to why we should care more about your well-constructed argument than theirs, you can win. But given that, other people might have also attended these seminars or, I don't know, have been taught or practiced how to weigh, if you're in a situation where they are weighing and telling me that actually maybe in the drugs debate that your impact about saving lives is not that important because it only affects a few people, and maybe their impact about making drugs more accessible to people matters more because even if it doesn't always have fatal outcomes, it affects a broader amount of people in society, right? So if you're having to prove, for example, why the severe impact on people who use drugs dying from overdoses when they can't use a safe supply, if you're having to prove why that matters more than their weighing metric, and you probably will at some point, so it's good to think about, is you want to think about using examples that illustrate to the judge sort of intuitively why it matters. These are often called intuition pumps, especially when they are hypothetical examples that create sort of thought experiments where you're trading off their weighing metric or their outcome for your weighing metric. So you can imagine a situation where if you're explaining why severity matters more, vulnerability of addicts matters more than the average person not getting exposed to drugs, you could intuit the idea of like, what if, we lived in a world where there was say that there's two potential viruses, right? That the government has to choose to allocate resources against in fighting. One of these viruses is super, super fatal. It kills like 100% of people, right? But it's not super contagious. Maybe only 1 in 50 people get it. Should the government prioritize dealing with that threat, or should it prioritize maybe treating a very contagious cold, right? Because a very contagious cold might affect way more people, but not as severely. So if you're trying to compare weighing metrics, it can be useful to think of, I just thought of that on the spot and I have a lot of practice doing this. You can also start to think about a list of these that become relevant in a variety of different contexts in debate. So every time you use it, you can even write it down and add it to a little bank of ways that you can, intuition pumps that you can turn back to explain why, for example, severity should be prioritized over number of people, quantity. Again, you could reverse that, right? You could try to do another intuition pump where it seems more intuitive to prioritize the number of people as opposed to severity. And that's just based on the examples you're choosing and how you're explaining them. You want to explain why what you're saying is intuitive to the average person, right? Because that's who the judge is supposed to be judging the debate by. And you could also double up weighing metrics again, like say, okay, well, it's not just severity, it's also vulnerability and obligation because addicts have been failed by the state, right? So you can add on those metrics, but you should explain why they are true. Okay, this brings us to the end. I have gone on quite a bit. This is a reminder to all of you that you can register for Seed Things. I'm sure Diggory and NACE will extend on this, but yeah, there's a championship coming up. You can register for it March 30th to 31st. I vouch for these people as being very smart and good at recruiting other smart people to help run fantastic events that you should definitely. Question time. Oh, yes. Okay, let me de-share this so that I can start looking at. Oh, yes. Okay, there was the invitation sent to people. Let me just make sure that there's no, to go back to the questions for today's seminar. I think the one question that I should address, because basically the two questions that we had were one, what is a weighing mechanism? And two, how do you do weighing in a way that's strong and effective? Both good questions. I think the second one we have probably covered because strong and effective is, making sure that you explain why it's true, that you're using a metric that is specific to the argument you're talking about, that you're explaining why your argument fits that metric, that you are illustrating examples of where we would care about that, right? Thinking of intuition pumps to make it intuitive to the judge. To address independently the question of what is a weighing mechanism, just because terminology can be confusing. So like mechanism, again, these terms are not like set in stone. They can be used differently to mean different things by different people. But generally a mechanism is a reason why something is true. And I think you might hear the term weighing mechanism when that person is typically referring to a weighing metric. And a metric is a way of like adjudicating something. So your judge is trying to adjudicate the round. They need to know which of these arguments that have all been mechanized, right, proven to be true, should be prioritized over the other arguments. And that is where the idea of a weighing metric comes in. Those are the things that we were going through on the list, right? A basis on which the judge should care more about this thing, this impact, than the other impact. Okay, there is a mailing list form that got sent. Oh, there's one more question that I want to address. Yeah, if the motion is a climate-related motion, and the clash is short-term and long-term impact. Yes, thank you. I actually don't think I focused on that weighing metric in the seminar, but that's a common one too. How should you weigh? Okay, so I think it all depends on the motion, right? But you want to, in prep time, be asking yourself, what are the inherent advantages and disadvantages to the motion on each side? So if you're Gov, maybe depending on the wording of the motion, it's going to be easier for you to prove the long-term harm. But maybe the certainty of that long-term harm is not super high, right? So it's like worst case climate scenario, you could argue that your world is more likely to avoid that at some short-term cost that op is going to be able to prove very easily, right? So you often see this clash in climate debates or environmental debates where Gov is saying, let's like put a massive carbon tax, for example, and op is like, well, that could harm business and lead to people losing their jobs in the short term, all these very real consequences. But on Gov, you're like, well, why should that matter when we have this really long-term concern, right, of protecting the world and making it livable for future generations? So again, this is a situation where you want to weighing metrics against one another. Think about what metrics could they use from their own perspective to make their short-term arguments more persuasive than yours. So maybe it's advantageous for them to argue that this debate should be judged on like certainty of impact, right? That their short-term impacts are that typically tend to be more certain. So job loss, like not guaranteed, but more likely than knowing, for example, that um, the city of Bangkok is going to be 10 feet underwater in like 10 years as opposed to 50 years. So long-term impacts, again, are harder to predict. So if you can figure out that that's the trade-off, right, that the debate is presenting to you, that op is going to try to argue certainty, probably, right, then you can start the debate from the position of weighing your metric against theirs and explaining why certainty is not the metric on which the debate should be judged. You can also, again, utilize the tool of refutation, which is complementary to weighing, to chip away at the analysis that they may give for why that short-term impact is certain, right? So anticipate where it's going to be strategic for them to put their, like, to spend their time analyzing. So if you know that their impacts that are most intuitively true and important are these short-term economic impacts, then probably, yeah, you should preempt why those things are not actually that certain in the first place, right? To try to win on their own metric. And then you should also be thinking about how you can intuit the idea that long-termism matters more, even when certainty is unclear. You could be piling on weighing metrics, right? Thinking about also number of people. So in the future, we're probably going to have way more. Wow, those words came out very quickly. Way more people in the world because of exponential population growth than we do now. So maybe even if our impact is uncertain, the amount of people who are going to suffer from it also, not just how long it's going to last, but the amount of people who will experience it as a result of it lasting for a long time, are going to be very substantial, right? As opposed to the people today, the number of people who will lose their jobs. Similarly, you could say like that the number of that the to go back to the moral culpability thing, right? Maybe people today, because they have participated in a world where, I don't know, they're like driving their car to work and using fossil fuels in a way that harms the environment because they have played a role, they're not innocent in the climate crisis today. Maybe we are more okay punishing them as opposed to the long-term potential innocent people in the future who are just going to be born into a world they had no say in creating, right? So you can see how piling on weighing metrics, so long as you explain them, can be a way to, in that example or in any example, get around the fact that they also have persuasive weighing metrics on their side. One more question. How do you weigh in a debate about love within family members? Okay, so again, it'll all depend on the motion. You're going to, it's a muscle that you're going to have to exercise. To judging is very helpful in doing so, right? To see how certain arguments tend to be interacting in a debate, what ends up being persuasive, what doesn't, what can be proven in a 5-minute gap, right? And what can't, because my big secret tip is that people forget that even if you could prove something is more important than something else, or that something is likely, and then weigh it very persuasively against another impact, if it's not something that you can do in 5 minutes, it's probably not going to survive in a round. So these things are things you get a sense of by practicing, by judging, speaking and reflecting on your speeches and getting feedback from judges. And yeah, so the answer is kind of, it depends. To think about love and relationships debates, it's typically going to come down to questions of like, what makes you the most fulfilled as a person, or what is your moral obligation to the people around you? So depending on whether it's a more principled argument that's intuitive or a practical argument, you might use different weighing metrics. But yeah, it'll really depend on the debate. The reason I give certain examples like climate or AI is that there are certain types of motions where there's this trade-off between like long-term existential threat and short-term, more probable threat that you really can start to predict. Or same with narrative motions, the idea of like having a counterbalancing force is quite common. Those themes are, not every area of debate will have those themes that you can just easily apply. So practice is key. Okay, I think unless there are any more questions, I'll hand it off.